Hey everybody, welcome to this episode of B2B Revealed. B2B Revealed brings you the best of B2B. Whether you're a B2B seller, a B2B marketer, or simply a B2B leader, this show will provide you the tools and insights you need to be successful. My name is Sean Campbell, and I'm your host. I love to hear from listeners. If you have any questions about the show, or you would like to suggest a topic I should cover in the future, just email me at sean@cascadeinsights.com. And finally, if you love this show, don't forget to write up a review for the show on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you happen to listen. On this episode, I'll be interviewing Tom Shoemaker, who has an extensive history leading sales and marketing efforts for technology companies, including PTC and itslearning. On this episode, I'll be talking to him about how to drive effective marketing efforts for technology products and services and how to engage with potential customers in the right way. In short, I'm sure you're going to love hearing what Tom has to say about the world of sales and marketing in a technology context. Also, as a side note, over the next 4 to 6 interviews on the show, you'll notice a bit of variance in the audio quality from interview to interview because I'm experimenting with a few different audio services to record those interviews, including IPDTL, Zencastr, Ringer, and Skype. Once I give each one a run for their money, I'll let you know which one I found out to be the best. And now, on to the show. So Tom, welcome to the show.
Hey, good to be here, Sean.
So Tom, tell the listeners a little bit about your background. As I mentioned in the intro, you've got a great background that spans 2 very different types of organizations.
Yeah, so I went to school for engineering and graduated and started working at a company that sold to engineers. So I did a variety of different jobs there. That company was called PTC, or Parametric Technology Corporation. Pre-sales and R&D, and then most of my time spent in marketing, and had a couple different, lot of variety in the products that we sold. So we can talk about desktop products versus enterprise products. I did that for a good long while, and then went to where I'm at now, which is a company called itslearning. It's an ed tech provider. So we make learning platforms for schools and school districts. So that's where I've been at here now for about 2 years.
Excellent. So the companies you worked for, they're obviously fairly different in size. I mean, PTC at this point is obviously an enterprise software company, and itslearning is in the mid-market size. So given a lot of people make that transition, either from the mid-market to the enterprise or the enterprise to the mid-market as marketers, what are some tips or just basically strategies you'd give them for being successful when they make a move like that?
Yeah, well, I guess what I would say is I always like to kind of bring it back to basics, and that is, it really is the buyer is at the heart of everything, regardless of if you're in an enterprise. If you're in a large organization that itself a large enterprise selling to other large enterprises, sometimes you can take that for granted and sort of miss that unless you step back periodically and think about it. It's still, you're talking human to human, and that's who is going to sign a purchase order. So that's one of the key things, is don't ever lose sight of that. And I think when you're at a smaller company, it's perhaps even more pointed that you need to be thinking that way. You need to be thinking about everything and how it affects the buyer, prospective buyer, from the beginning of when they're first learning about you or searching for a problem that you may solve when they don't even know about you, all the way through and well beyond when they actually purchase and then implement your software.
Well, let's go back to a statement you made there about taking things for granted, because I've certainly seen that. I think other people have that have either worked with or interacted with enterprise companies or shared experiences with software here, but I think it's probably true in other industries too. What does it look like when a company's taking customers for granted in that way and they're not getting back to basics? I mean, not to point out anybody in particular in PTC. I mean, we're not trying to do that, but just in general, what are some of the warning signs when a company starts to take its customer base for granted in that kind of enterprise to enterprise scenario?
Yeah, well, you leave yourself open for disruption, and it's probably a well-told story at PTC, so it's fine to bring it back up. But the business on which PTC was built was computer-aided design, CAD software. And it really had a phenomenal start, really introduced something unique to the market, had explosive growth, and then started to dabble in other areas, made some other acquisitions, and then I really allowed an entry for some lower end CAD competitors to come in and, even by their own admission, offer a fraction of what PTC's solution could do, but also a fraction of the cost. And it really was taking the eye off the ball from that existing market, and therefore by proxy, those customers on the backs of whom helped build PTC to where it was at that point in time. So you can have all sorts of bad things happen if you take your eye off the ball.
That's fair. And you're right. That is a well-told story in terms of, you can see it in books as far back as The Innovator's Dilemma or things like that. So as a marketing team, given you don't own the product, I think one of the things listeners might be thinking is, well, fine, product development could maybe build a cheaper, meaner, leaner product that gets back to the jobs to be done that originally you guys targeted, or maybe the pricing team finds a way to restructure pricing, or leadership finds a way to kind of work through all of that. But as a marketing team, when you face that challenging upstart who's actually doing a good job solving for the customer's problem, you can't just discount them. What did you start to think about was a good set of strategies and tactics to respond?
Well, at that point anyway, again, reflecting back on the PTC experience, we were ourselves undergoing a transformation. And we're starting to realize that even if we may have kind of taken our eye off that ball, there were other important things in play for our buyers, or buyers that would sit right next to the existing buyers that we're servicing and selling to. So we had a larger remit, if you will, where we started to look at solving more of the problems of a manufacturing enterprise, not just the ones related to doing design that an engineer would do at their desktop. That quickly no longer was the long pole in the tent, if you will. There were lots of other things surrounding it, which gave us that, along with acquisitions we're making and a transformation in how we were telling our story and articulating the value that we could offer, really helped take us from what was a bit of a rough patch to becoming a true process-oriented and value-based selling, consultative selling B2B software company.
So how did you change how you told the story?
Well, one of the big things that we did was we documented the value that manufacturing organizations could reap from an investment in product development technology. And we did it in a way that was not laden with our lingo or our product brands, instead directly spoke to the customer. So to make it very specific, we created a piece of paper, a poster-size document we called the Value Roadmap. And on it, we depicted the typical processes that we would see in a company like John Deere or Airbus or any other large manufacturing organization. And we systematically talked about the things that mattered throughout the process of going from design to manufacturing to service. And then we articulated the things that companies ought to be looking for in a technology provider. Again, we did it in a very brand agnostic way and talked about the value that could be offered in taking an approach like this. And by association, we got a lot of credit because, of course, it was us there having this discussion with a prospective customer. But never did we really emphasize the fact that it had to be our captive technology to do it.
That's a really good example. I think a lot of companies can follow, especially enterprise size where they have a lot of different products and they're having trouble telling the story in a cohesive way. So how did you keep your team focused? As you spent more time at PTC, you eventually moved from pre-sales and eventually you're a VP of marketing who's leading a marketing strategy for basically a $500 million solution. What did you do to keep your team focused on the customer? Because at least what I've seen, it's really easy for these enterprise companies to just get focused on internal perspectives and internal processes, and none of them actually have even visited a customer sometimes for an extended period of time. So at least on teams that aren't sales oriented. So how did you keep them focused on the customer and always learning what they actually wanted as opposed to just dealing with whatever their perception of the day may be?
Yeah, well, it's a great question and it's a challenge and it's a continuous challenge. And I can't say that always did it in the best way. I think regardless of how many customer conversations you have, you should probably have twice as many or more So I think having a recurring item on your schedule, on your calendar, to go back and refresh your personas every, let's say, 18 months is an important thing to do. And I'm not suggesting that you wait 18 months before you go and talk to these folks. But that's, I think, one very specific thing that all technology marketers, all marketers really need to do. And having that and sort of organizing efforts around making sure that you're refreshing your personas with some frequency is one good point that you can emphasize with your teams. Other points that you can emphasize would be doing win-loss analyses. So after you hopefully win a customer, getting on the phone with them and having a dialogue about, well, what was the tipping point? What made you first look for such a solution? And then ultimately, what made you go with our solution? And then equally or even more valuable would be the loss analysis, right? Same questions, really. What was the tipping point that made you look for something? And then why'd you go elsewhere? Those were a couple things. And then another thing that's important, and it sort of does double duty because you want to create content, is arrange a schedule of customer case studies and customer testimonial videos. And in doing that, you're getting yourself out there on the road. You're getting your team out there on the road. You're capturing the customer stories. You're walking around with them. You're having the casual conversation, making small talk and building goodwill and learning about what they do every day. And then you run the camera and you capture their story and you get a great content piece that you can reuse on your website and in your campaigns and everywhere else.
Every one of those is great ideas. I think those are wonderful things for folks to consider and implement when they're facing that kind of scenario. Let me go back, though, to the very first one. We could talk about each one of them, but just in the interest of time, I want to go back to the persona one for a minute. How did you keep your persona development from turning into what I think you've probably seen too, I know I have, where the personas are these kind of very high-level things about the people? Bob is a 32-year-old IT manager kind of thing. And they're not actually about what drove them to engage. And worse yet, to reflect back on something you said even earlier, they don't necessarily correlate with each other sometimes. Like you mentioned, you were selling to one persona in essence, and then there's another persona in the company who's maybe buying competing products, and you realize you could actually work with them as well. How did you keep your personas real? Because so often I crack open a persona a client might send me that's been previously built, and it's just this really high level stuff. And I think I couldn't build marketing off this, and I certainly couldn't do any sales activities off this. So how do you get them deep enough that they're meaningful?
We definitely went very deep. We developed for each persona what we call the value framework. And in fact, maybe it was too deep. I mean, these are pretty dense documents. So if we're selling to the VP of engineering, for example, we had as a reference document this value framework, and it was probably a 30-page document or something where it went through systematically what were the things that they cared about, what were their drivers, and those would likely be the things that are kind of written up on a whiteboard or would keep them awake at night. And from there, we then systematically went through, okay, then what are the things that are standing in their way right now? Like, what are the challenges they have now preventing them from having good results against those drivers? Okay, and then we went to how would they want to flip that current state around to a better world, right? A positive business outcome. And really, that's what we did. We systematically went through all these steps and documented and went through with different teams involving people from the field, doing some sanity checking with people on the outside, friendly customers, analysts, and what have you, so that ultimately we had a very rich set of actionable data that gave us, for every persona, the things they care about, the challenges they have, the areas that they like to improve, what metrics would they use to measure improvement, what things could we offer, how would we prove that we've got a differentiated advantage, and then some third-party proof so that they're not just taking it from us. That was a lot of work, but it really helped give that richness to the persona.
It sounds like you guys did an excellent job. I mean, the number of times I've seen a 30-page persona is pretty rare. But to your point, you need that kind of richness to actually make some meaningful actions off it. So I think that's really great. Let's swing around and talk a little bit about itslearning here just for a minute or two. So this is obviously a mid-market company. It's much smaller. than what you came from in PTC. What are some of the marketing tactics that are perhaps easier to implement in a mid-market company versus an enterprise company? And if you want to tackle some of the things that are more challenging perhaps to implement, beyond the obvious fact that maybe you have a little less revenue to deal with when it comes to marketing initiatives, what are some of those pros and cons from the tactics side?
Yeah, not sure if anything's easier. I mean, maybe easier in the regard that where I was previously, we had a relatively large marketing organization. Maybe it was, by the time I left, 140 people or so. And that was spread throughout different business units and different territories and things like that. So obviously we're much smaller. So there are fewer disparate groups that you kind of have to involve in that discussion. But, still getting people aligned is a challenge when you're dealing with selling to 10 different countries. And as a small mid-market provider, it's challenging. I mean, we sold into about the same number, let's say, from PTC, where we got most of our revenue. So you have kind of the same breadth of geographic coverage that you're trying to achieve, in our case anyway, but much smaller in scale in terms of resources, people, and dollars. So that's a big challenge. I would say something that is different is my purview is larger here. So I've got more ready ability to have an impact across the board, from web to social to product marketing and everything in between.
And I would imagine too that the degree of accountability, or at least visibility to that effect, is probably a little bit different. And this isn't to denigrate anybody who works in an enterprise company in a marketing role, but I think it's practical, right? If you go to the Windows marketing team at Microsoft, let's say, and they have, who knows, maybe 1,000 marketers, right, across all the different market segments they target. It becomes a little challenging when Windows starts to lose market share to say which marketing team or which set of marketers actually contributed the most negatively to that, or who had the most positive effect in slowing that. But when you go to a mid-market and you're in the role like you are, I imagine there's also a much bigger flashlight kind of pointed at you from an accountability standpoint. But that also probably has a little bit of a plus side, is that when something goes well, you're like, we did that. It wasn't just this amorphous larger team.
Yeah, you're exactly right. The spotlight is hot and it's continuous. So you make mistakes and it's known, and you do some good things, and hopefully that's acknowledged and recognized as well.
So you've been in a marketing leadership role for a long time now across both enterprise and mid-market roles. So over that 20 years or so, what would you say are the things marketers should focus on if they want to be successful over the long haul? Not with a specific campaign or a specific initiative, but if they really want to have a long and successful career, what are some of the things they should focus on?
Yeah, I think some of the things they should focus on would be the same regardless if you're talking about in a marketing capacity or anything else. And I would say, don't be afraid to raise your hand, jump in, and do what needs doing, right? Provided that you're kind of doing your job and getting that stuff accomplished to the extent that you can make yourself invaluable and adaptable and take on whatever challenges are out there. That helps you individually, that helps the organization. That's one big thing. Another thing is just don't be a jerk, right? I mean, we're working with people. It gets challenging at times. You want to be able to have teammates that you enjoy going through that struggle with. And no one wants to work with a jerk. An old boss I had talked about whether or not interview candidates would pass the beer test. And what he meant by that was, look, if you ran into this person randomly in the airport, would you be okay sitting down having a beer with them, or would you kind of dread that? And that's a pretty important thing. So it's work. You need people that are good and productive and all that, but you want people that you want to work with. So be that kind of person.
Yeah, and I think that last point, I wonder if you'd agree with this, is that because marketing has, there's certainly an analytical component to marketing, and there's an increasing amount of that. Like, I want to hire the analytical marketer, not just the creative one. But I think at its core, there's a lot of creativity that has to go into it so you can be successful in kind of creating a campaign or a go-to-market that works. And I think it's hard to be creative with people you don't like, basically. It's hard to have that kind of robust connection. So I imagine that's part of it too.
Exactly right.
Well, Tom, I just want to thank you for being on the show. You had a lot of great perspectives to share, and I think people love listening to it. So best of luck to you at itslearning, and thanks again for joining.
All right. Thank you, Sean.
And that concludes the interview I had with Tom on the subject of sales and marketing in a technology context. I truly enjoyed chatting with Tom, and I hope you learned a lot from the interaction I had with him. As a closing note, don't forget to visit Tom's current company, It's Learning. And also, don't forget to visit us at cascadeinsights.com. Thanks for listening.